So Steve, I see we are having people from all around the US plus Mexico, Aberdeen.
The COVID-19 has truly provided a global.
And you got a special hello from Mark Northam.
Mark was my boss, is retiring from the University of Wyoming and trying to find his way back to his new home in Norway, and is stuck in the US for a little while. So hello, good morning, Mark.
Okay, I believe we are good to start the session. We have 23 so far in the meeting, and it will definitely increase. So hello everyone, it's Hamid Saroush here, CEO of Petrolern LLC. And I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Stephen Carpenter, our expert speaker today, with his attractive topic regarding the carbon sequestration. As you already know, the objective of this seminar series is to keep you learning and motivated during this difficult time we are all facing and going through. Specifically, we are trying to actually set up the speakers somehow that we get several talks on topics out of oil and gas industry, such as geothermal energy, carbon storage, carbon utilization, and also thermal energy storage, with the hope that we can help people that who have lost their job or they're at risk of losing the job in oil and gas, find their ways and opportunities outside the oil and gas industry. We are very pleased at Petrolern to be able to feel part of your time during this, depressing time with some, technical knowledge that our speakers actually share with us. And I'm really happy to see actually people participating from all around the world and different countries, different cultures. To name some, actually, we have got some people from Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, South Korea, which time-wise are actually right after midnight in their locations. So they kindly, joined our sessions. Also, we got big number of participants from India, Iran, Nigeria, China, Pakistan, Algeria, Canada, and of course, United States. So to name some more locations that we got people in during the last 2 months that we were providing the P.A.S.S talk. We had people from Mexico, UK, Switzerland, Denmark, Germany, Kazakhstan, Egypt, Ghana, South Africa, Turkey, Norway, Austria, Romania, Vietnam, UAE, and Saudi. So if I missed any location, just forgive me. But we are really happy to be able to basically help knowledge sharing with our participants during the last 2 months. I would like to express my sincere gratitude again to all the industry experts, industry leaders who accepted to give the talks, like Dr. Carpenter. The good news for you is that the June schedule is ready. We have 9 very exciting talks scheduled for June. We will have 2 talks every week, one basically, I would say every Tuesday and every Friday, around the same time that we are having this talk today. If you are interested to give a talk and you think you have an interesting topic, attractive topic, the July schedule is quite open, and we can basically put you in a schedule. We have still 3 more talks for May. Please make sure you follow us on LinkedIn and our website to actually receive to see the updates about the past talks. And again, we are opening some job position actually in the next 1 or 2 months. Just keep your eyes open for the opportunities. Our next seminar is on May 26th, another geothermal talk from Denmark by Tina Rasmussen, titled Geothermal Play Area Mapping, a case story from Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia. It's actually a collaborative work between Petrolern, Well-Perform, and South Company, trying to look for geothermal resources in the east south of the U.S., which is less, known for geothermal resources, but we are trying to actually try to find some medium-low temperature geothermal resources in this part of the U.S. So before introducing Dr. Carpenter, I would like to ask everyone to mute themselves, turn off the cameras to have the best quality. If you have any questions, please use the chat box and write your questions. You can also raise your hand if you prefer to have direct interaction with Steve. Steve will kindly answer as many questions as possible, considering his timing. If for any reason you lost your connection with us, we are recording this session and we will share it on our website tomorrow. So please feel free to go and watch it online. So Dr. Carpenter is a seasoned executive with 30 plus years of experience in the energy and CCUS space. He's an internationally recognized subject matter expert on enhanced oil recovery, climate change, carbon, and risk management issues. Dr. Carpenter is the executive director of the University of Wyoming Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, a board member of the Wyoming Energy Authority, and head of delegation and chair of the United States Technical Advisory Group, TAG, for ISO Technical Committee TC 265, carbon dioxide capture, transportation, and geological storage. Dr. Carpenter holds degrees in physics, environmental public policy, and transdisciplinary approaches to CO2 EOR. He's going to actually present a very attractive title, is CCUS feasible in Wyoming? Wyoming's unique position in the world CCUS arena, the cowboy unicorn. With that said, I would like to pass it to Dr. Carpenter to give us his interesting presentation. Steve, stage is yours.
Very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good day for all of you, and welcome. My hope and expectation is that based on the title, that I can make you both understand and believe in unicorns by the time we're finished, and that the magical discussion and the journey we're going to go on, I want you to hopefully leave here realizing it's not that magical, it's actually real, and it occurs in the state of Wyoming. My intent today is to talk about a few things and set some context, and so I'll apologize in advance if the presentation is over or undershoots your current knowledge of CCUS. But to set some context, because we have a diverse group, talk a little bit about the subsurface. Many of us in the industry use different terminologies for primary, secondary, or tertiary recovery on the enhanced oil recovery side. I tend to use, for diverse audiences, the Tropicana orange example. Many of you may have seen the Tropicana orange commercial where the individual says there's nothing in our orange juice but oranges. If you imagine that orange as a reservoir and you stick a straw in the orange and orange juice comes out, that's primary production. There's enough energy in the reservoir that the oil is produced from the reservoir without doing anything other than accessing it. At some point in time, that orange juice is no longer going to come out of that straw, and you're going to have to stick a second straw in the other side of that orange juice and re-energize it. You got to put some water, some CO2, or something else in that orange to get the orange juice to come out. Many of you may have, like I do, don't eat oranges often enough and leave them in the basket on the counter, and they get old and hard. Sometimes I take them and roll them between my hands. I've been known to throw them in a microwave for 2 or 3 seconds and revitalize, squinch that around before you cut it, and it kind of brings it back to life. That's tertiary production, where we're actually changing the physics of the rock. And so many people who hear of our institute and work with the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute sometimes think we only deal with the tertiary and the enhanced piece. But our role in for today's discussion, we wanted to set the context of primary, secondary, tertiary. And then we're going to talk a little bit about saline storage, where we're going to be injecting CO2 into a reservoir that already has available pore space, as exemplified by the sponge there on the bottom left. We're going to move into some context setting for Economics 101. And when we talk about CCUS, there's a cost. We're going to have to build the equipment. We're going to have to finance and pay for it. There's going to be ongoing O&M, and there's going to be energy penalties depending on if you're putting it on an existing power plant. And in the end, whatever that cost is has to be less than whatever incentives you're getting, $35 a ton or $50 a ton for CO2 or saline, plus the sales that you get from EOR minus what it costs to get you there. On the saline side, that cost of capture has to be less than the credit you're getting, less the storage charges, and the cost to get it to the reservoir. Simple Economics 101. And I'm sure many of you have seen examples of some aspects of this from a saline standpoint. The Shell Quest project in Canada, along with Sleipner, and the ADM project in Illinois are examples of saline storage. Many of you may be aware of the Sask Power Boundary Dams project in Canada, or the Petronova NRG project in Houston. While those 5 are all storage projects, the capture piece may be similar. They may be using liquid chilled amine. They may be using membranes. Whatever the capture mechanism may be, the storage mechanism in the subsurface is a bit different between saline and EOR, even though we talk about them generically as being the same. They fit into the CCUS bucket. In the early days of carbon capture and storage, folks called carbon capture and storage carbon capture and sequestration. Sequestration is a legal term, and so many jurisdictions, especially in Europe, didn't like that. And so we changed it to carbon capture and storage. And then about a half a decade or so ago, we added the U for utilization. And early on, we meant CO2 EOR. But now we're adding another use for the term utilization, where we're actually, instead of putting that CO2 in the ground to store it, can we use it to make products? Can we use it from a beneficiation standpoint and make carbon products, carbon fibers, chemicals, and a whole host of other things? And so the U tends to mean other things than just CO2 EOR. And in the same, Economics 101, whatever the cost of that capture has to be less than the incentives that you're going to receive from manufacturing that, the sale of that product, and the cost of capture. So much of this early discussion is to say, what do we need to do to make CCUS feasible? I'm assuming many of you may be SPE members. SPE, Society of Petroleum Engineers, has a unique event called a forum. And a forum is an opportunity to gather 50 to 100 thought leaders. It's invitation only. It's 3 days, and you're, no pun intended, sequestered. In the old days, these happened at relatively innovative and destinations that one might call a resort. Southeast Asia, Fiji, Hawaii. But in today's world, San Antonio is what's known as a resort because of travel restrictions. But SPE brings this group of thought leaders together in a quote unquote safe environment. You're sequestered for 3 days, you're given food and beverage, and you're locked in these hotel conference rooms, and you're asked several questions. And in 2018, SPE brought together 75 thought leaders from the CCUS industry and said, okay, what do we need to make CCUS happen? What's missing? And as part of that conversation, there was very early agreement that we have in the industry a whole lot of very smart chemical and process engineers who know how to deal with the capture side, whether it's membranes, whether it's chilled ammonia. We've known for decades how to store and transport materials underground, be it natural gas, water, CO2. And so the symposium, the forum, posed the real question of what else is missing. And at the end of those 3 days, you'll see some bullet items there that you'll as you look at them, you realize they're not necessarily technical in nature. Where are we going to put the CO2? Is there a good set of regulatory environment to support making this happen? In the jurisdiction where this happened, is there an understanding of the market? Can we move the CO2 around? Is there a set of incentives back to the early blue, green, and red boxes? Are there more green boxes than reds? And can you find some folks that would support you in this process? And so I'm going to suggest that if the CCUS industry as a takeaway says these are the things that are needed, ask the question, does a place like that actually exist? And for my American friends, you can recognize the size and shape of my home state of Wyoming. For those of you that are not, I pose the satirical question of what if there was a magical state, a state that we just drew as a square in the United States? And what if that place had a bunch of very favorable things? What if it had a significant amount of technically recoverable oil, that in order to get at that recoverable oil, i.e. CO2 EOR, you needed a fair amount of CO2 to get it out of the ground? What if you had 50 to 100 fields available to you that you could provide yourself 1.6 billion barrels of incremental production, and you needed somewhere on the range of 750 million metric tons of CO2 to get that out? That would be a really good thing to have available to you. If you were a saline storage only project, and that is you didn't want to produce additional hydrocarbons, Wyoming has two very significant saline storage, one in the southwest corner of the state at what's known as the Rock Springs Uplift, and one in the northeast corner of the state in Gillette. Both of those have been studied by the Department of Energy under the Carbon Safe program and have identified relatively significant injectivity and storage capacity, and are located near significant electric utility, coal-fired power plants, and pipelines. What if this magical place had a set of regulatory environment or support that specifically identified who owned the pore space, and that wasn't a question? I would argue that the United States is unique in that we have private property ownership. And so all of my friends around the world in other jurisdictions don't wrestle with this issue of pore space because the Crown or the state owns it. And so it's an easy legal liability issue to address because the government ultimately owns it. But that's not the case in the United States. Wyoming also has a set of established rules and procedures for permitting CCUS sites. They provide a mechanism for post-closure and monitoring, reporting, and verification. If any of you have experience in the nuclear industry, the Price-Anderson Act is an American process that's identified the notion that if there is an accident like Fukushima, the concern was that the insurance industry itself wouldn't be large enough to support the cleanup. And so the Price-Anderson Act requires nuclear power plants to pay into a trust fund so that if there's an incident, there's additional and sufficient fees to clean that up. Wyoming provides a similar mechanism for CO2 post-closure liability via trust fund. It also provides a mechanism for the unitization of storage interests in a very similar fashion that we consider unitization of producing interests. Because Wyoming is a producing state, we tend to give a bit of precedence to the producer. And in this case, the injector and not the pore space owner is generally liable if something were to happen that needs to be cleaned up. And that the production rights are dominant to storage rights because it's important for our economy and the production of energy and hydrocarbons that be the case. And we also provide an opportunity to ensure that CO2 stored by EOR is considered storage. I know there's discussion in jurisdictions both within and without the United States, whether or not CO2 EOR is actually considered storage. US EPA has settled that that argument and has acknowledged that CO2 EOR is considered permanent storage. And many of you may be aware of the 45Q notion, and there's a discussion of what are the mechanisms between the EPA's subpart RR and 45Q to ensure that, but that's defined both federally and within the state of Wyoming. Additionally, there are two types of wells in the United States for storage: Class 2 for CO2 EOR and Class 6 for saline storage. The federal government has primacy or the right to manage those. Within the United States, North Dakota has applied for and received primacy. That means that the state of North Dakota manages the process for permitting Class 6 wells in the state. And the state of Wyoming is second in line, and we have applied for, and the EPA has proposed a rule that's currently in the public comment period. And we expect that by sometime later this year, Wyoming will be the second state in the union that has primacy for Class 6 wells. And many people have the discussion about, well, what's the difference between, they're both storage wells, but they're very different wells. And you'll see the major takeaways here between a Class 2. There's about 180,000 Class 2 wells in the United States versus only 2 existing Class 6 permits. They're order of magnitude different between the cost, less than $1 million versus $5 million. Permitting takes about 90 days on the Class 2 side. Typically, the 2 permits that are in place, the 4 permits that have been issued by the EPA, have each taken more than 3 years to get through that permitting process. So imagine if you're a project developer and you want to put a CCUS project in place, and you're going to have to assume that you're going to lose 3 years in the permitting process. That's a significant risk both on the development side and the financing side that in many cases might make the project not be able to move forward. One of the things that we wrestle with in the United States is retirement of EPA institutional knowledge. The folks that have done those Class 6 permits at the EPA are at retirement age. And the EPA has acknowledged that they expect in the next 2 years that 60% of their Class 6 permitting knowledge will go away via retirement. And so lastly, then we have the notion from a credit storage standpoint of how do we certify that ton of CO2 that's in the ground is where we want it to be. And under the Class 2 rules, you use EPA's greenhouse gas subparts PP and UU, and for Class 6 or subpart RR. So Class 6 wells matter, and if there are mechanisms by which we can shorten this permitting time and reduce the cost because of the permitting time, then that certainly has a benefit to the industry as a whole. I posed the question, what if a project developer came to a state and they had an opportunity to knock on one door and pick up make one phone call and have access to all the pieces, parts they needed? The state of Wyoming, in its vision and planning, has merged the Wyoming Pipeline Authority and the Wyoming Infrastructure Authority into a new entity known as the Wyoming Energy Authority. That entity will take effect at the beginning of the fiscal year on July 1st. It'll have $4 billion of bonding capacity. It will house the State Energy Office, the Integrated Test Center, and provide access to folks on the energy production, infrastructure, CO2 pipeline, a significant one-stop shop for project developers who want to move forward with the CCUS project. Wyoming has also been very visionary in recently it passed House Bill 200. And that many of you who have worked on CCUS projects and work with coal-fired power plants understand that in many cases you have utilities, especially investor-owned utilities or IOUs, that are willing to do carbon capture and storage, but the rules preclude them from doing any capital cost recovery and an inability to pass on those costs to build the capture plant onto the rate base. So Wyoming is trying to both understands and trying to provide mechanisms so that utilities can move forward. House Bill 200 recognizes that if they do invest capital funds for this, that those capital funds can be recuperated, can be passed on to the rate base. And the mechanism they've chosen to do that is to say CCUS is a green technology. It's dispatchable and reliable and is a low carbon energy, and therefore it should fall into the normal processes that utilities have to go through. Wyoming has what's known as the CREG, the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group. It's a confidential group of stakeholders from the state of Wyoming. They get together every year and every quarter then update what is our 5-year rolling evaluation look like for revenues that will be generated from royalties and ad valorem taxes, which have a direct impact to the state of Wyoming. It's updated quarterly. It evaluates mineral prices and production, and being able to operate in a state where both the state and you as a developer can have a forward look of 5 years of what may happen. Now, we're all living currently in COVID-19, and I would argue that no one was able to foresee that. But I would argue that mechanisms like the Craig report provide Wyoming an opportunity to say, okay, we are where we are, almost like a history matching, where we can go in and revise that and have a better understanding of what does our financial future look like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years out in advance. Wyoming has a very significant CO2 infrastructure. We currently have existing pipelines to connect 2 significant sources, Chute Creek and Lost Cabin, of CO2 production to pipelines and CO2 EOR facilities in the state. Wyoming is unique in the world in that it has taken up, and what you see in front of you is a map of pre-approved pipeline corridors. Wyoming is significant in that much of our land is owned by the federal government. And so our Bureau of Land Management is party to many of the permits that we have to get. So imagine if you are a CO2 developer and you need to put a 12-mile or a 25-mile pipeline between your source and your sink. You're not just dealing with a landowner. You're dealing with potentially, fee-based private landowners. You're dealing with the state of Wyoming, and in many cases, you're dealing with the federal government. Wyoming, in its vision, has said, listen, we think we know where the major sources are. We think we know where the major likelihood of sinks are. So why don't we get out in front of this? And so what you see here is a map of pipeline corridors that have been pre-approved. That is to say, the state's looked at the most economical way to get from point A to point B and done some pre-NEPA permitting to hopefully short circuit and shorten the amount of permitting time it takes to get a permit in place, and to share with developers where's the best and most likely place to move within this checkerboard of property ownership that we have in the state of Wyoming. Further to that notion, Wyoming as a state participates in the Carbon Capture Coalition and in a group called the Regional Carbon Deployment Initiative. And one of the intents are to create several regional CO2 transportation infrastructure hubs. Wyoming will be the first state to sign on to that, to try and partner with other states with similar interests and similar needs that have sources of CO2 and sinks to move forward some regional approaches to getting CO2 from point A to point B. Shared earlier in the slides, the blue, green, and red slides. We in the United States have the 45Q tax credit, which provides $35 a ton for saline storage. $35 a ton for CO2 EOR and $50 a ton for saline storage. That provides a significant financial incentive to make the economics work. Now, this isn't specific to Wyoming, but certainly is specific to the United States. For all of my non-American friends, I'll apologize for this example. The state of Wyoming passed Senate File 159. And for my American colleagues and American football fans, the Cleveland Browns owner sold the team in the middle of the night and moved them from Cleveland to Baltimore. And the fans in Cleveland were very upset that in the middle of the night, their team was sold out from underneath them and moved. And so the state of Ohio passed a law. The owner of the Cleveland Browns' name was Art Modell. And they passed a law called the Modell Rule. And the Modell Rule says if there are any professional sports franchises that are going to be sold and moved, there has to be transparency, and they have to be first offered for sale to stay where they are. 2 years ago, that rule was applied for the first time, and now I'm going to include my non-American and especially my European friends and say it applied to a soccer team. United States MLS Soccer, the Columbus Crew, The owners wanted to move them from Ohio to Texas, and this rule made them consider the sale of the team to another owner, which kept them in Columbus, and so that rule appeared to be applicable and work. The state of Wyoming has a similar rule that says if a utility wants to shutter and close a coal-fired power plant, before it does that, it first must offer that plant for sale to allow it to continue to operate by another owner. This is significant in that it provides at least opportunities for plants to remain open, to continue to burn Powder River Basin coal, to continue to have those jobs, and opens a door for the applicability to apply carbon capture to it to extend the life of the plant. I would argue that many of you in the carbon capture industry work with a lot of utilities, but I would argue I've never found a utility that has been willing on its own to stand up and say, I'm interested in putting a carbon capture facility on my plant. All of my experiences around the world have all been incentivized by governments mandating that to happen, or federal entities like the Department of Energy or others providing significant financing to incentivize that. Pacificor owns the Rocky Mountain Power Facility called Dave Johnson, and they have a commercial stand on its own expression of interest to put carbon capture. And there are two entities, one in Wyoming, Glenrock Energy, and one out of Chicago, Jupiter Oxygen Corporation, as a technology provider, that are discussing with this entity to put carbon capture on their facility. Wyoming is very unique in that in the northeast corner of the state, we have a power plant, a basin electric plant called Dry Fork Station. That plant was built in 2007. And at that plant, we house the Integrated Test Center. The Integrated Test Center was the vision of former Governor Meade, and has been carried on with Governor Gordon as an opportunity for folks from around the world to come in and test their capture technologies on real flue gas. In many cases, in the bench and pilot scale, we use manufactured flue gas. This is an opportunity to have significant both volume and real flue gas to test real world conditions. I would also argue that this plant is unique in that it is the newest and cleanest and is a zero water discharge plant. The International Standards Organization Technical Committee 265 on CCUS visited this plant last summer. There are about 80 folks from around the world that were at this plant. And if you can see my cursor, we're standing in this grassy parking lot here, which is where these two facilities are. This is an older picture. And standing at the plant and hearing a presentation about the ITC and saying, oh, that's great. When's the power plant going to start running? This was the third week of June. It's about 80 degrees outside in Wyoming, a beautiful clear sky. And we said, what do you mean, when's it going to start running? It's been operating for 2 years. It's running now. And our European friends could not believe that this was a coal-fired power plant because of how clean it was, and B, that it was running at full capacity because of how quiet it is. So Wyoming has a unique situation here that I'll talk about in more detail, why I think this plant is unique in the world. At that plant at the ITC, there are several folks who are testing their technologies. On the left, J. Cole and Kawasaki, MTR, the University of Kentucky, and TDA are hosts of the state of Wyoming who are there using those test bays to look at their test their capture facilities and technologies. We also have as a member the X Prize. Now, the X Prize is a competition, and they are managing 5 entities. You'll see 2 from the United States. We have colleagues from India, Scotland, and China that are there as well, and they're actually competing for dollars. So I pose the question to you that I've already given away the answer. What if all these places existed in one location in the world? And many of you have heard the Silicon Valley icon in California. I would argue that Wyoming has and is building a carbon ecology in the Wyoming Carbon Valley. In the northeast part of the state, and in broader terms, if you look at the rest of the state, Wyoming has the ability to take CO2 to market, has the ability to take CO2 to products, and has to produce products. We can do saline storage and we can do CO2 EOR storage. So for me, when I look at putting all those together in one county, in one corner of the state of Wyoming, I sometimes have to sit back and say, do those things all really exist? Can we do all those things? And the answer is yes. In addition to the utilization opportunity at the ITC, Wyoming is also developing the Advanced Carbon Products Innovation Center. It's a former coal mine that's taking coal to products, is looking both not only at that coal, but able to bring in other sources of coal from around the world and test technologies to convert that coal into other products. As I shared with you, Wyoming is significantly unique in that we have multiple utilities as opposed to just one. The Basin Electric Dry Fork Station, which we've shown you a picture of, is housed the ITC. The listed number 3, the Dave Johnson Power Plant, you saw a picture of. If you add in Jim Bridger and Naughton, the other 2 listed there in green, items 2, 3, and 4 are currently being studied by the U.S. Department of Energy for a CCUS retrofit techno-economic analysis. There have been entities talking with Laramie River and the Wild Deck Power Station. Again, to have a state that has 6 electric utilities that are willing to have conversations with, I would say, is unprecedented. So my final closing slide here, I want to talk a little bit about electric generation and set the stage for why I think Wyoming really is a unicorn. For those of you who've been in the electric generation industry or been around plants historically, especially for a coal-fired power plant, the plan was to get that plant running, get it warm, get it up to speed, and leave it alone. Let it run at 100% as base load. In the old days, we called that base load. And we had natural gas peaker plants that would ramp up and ramp down when our demands were necessary. I would argue that as green energy and green requirements have come into the market, we've changed from base load to what many people call firming load or following load. In many cases now, coal-fired power plants are following dispatchability and they're not turned on like they were for base load. And so that raises some questions about the reliability of that plant running. And so I'm going to try and close here with my argument of Occam's razor applied to CCUS. There are many facilities around the world that look at coal products, coal to products, and the utilization of CO2. If in the process of running and implementing your process, that technology goes down for maintenance, scheduled or otherwise, you're no longer going to be able to take that CO2 and put it into your product, and you're going to have to vent it. And if you do, you're going to likely have a permit violation or some other violation that's going to cause a problem to the evaluation of how that plant is running. If you're a straight saline storage facility, we've seen several pictures of those, Aquastor, Sleipner, the ADM facility in Illinois. If you have an injector or a monitoring well or a pipeline issue and you have to stop injecting and shut those wells in for a period of time, you're still going to have to vent that CO2 and again, create potential permit implications. I would argue the same is true for EOR. We are in an unprecedented time of low commodity prices, and economically, you may not be able to make economics work, and so you may have to shut in. And if you shut in, then you're going to have venting and other issues. All 3 of these individual processes exist around the country. And in any one of these scenarios, there's going to be legal permit issues. And I would argue, as we look at developing commercial deployment, financing, and those folks who provide the backing for these projects are going to look at these things as risk and say each one of these has risk of will your plant be running or not. Wyoming is unique in that the Basin Electric Dry Fork Station has the ability to provide all 3 of these. At any given time, a ton of CO2 coming out of that stack at Basin Electric could be used for utilization issues. It could at any time be used to do saline storage or for EOR storage. This provides some opportunities to ensure permit de-risking, that no matter what happens to any one of those three technologies, you always have an outlet to dispose of and move that CO2 somewhere else. It also provides an opportunity to shift between any one of those three at whatever provides the most economical return. If the products you're making have a significant impact and demand in the marketplace and there's value, then put 100% of that flow to making of a product. When oil prices rebound and CO2 EOR provides a better rate of return than straight injection, it provides the flexibility to do that. And individually, utilization, saline, and EOR storage happens all over the world. But nowhere else in the world does it happen in the same place that provides the opportunity for de-risking of projects and ensuring that the project can move forward with both economical and environmental permit resolution. So that concludes my presentation. I know it might sound a little corny, but I do believe in unicorns, and I do believe in the state of Wyoming, and this is a very unique and special place. I appreciate your time and attention. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much, Stephen. It's really amazing to hear what you are doing in the state of Wyoming, and I believe the state can be used as a role model for other states and other countries. Maybe they can find their unicorn as well.
I appreciate it. We certainly feel that way, but it's always good when others feel that way as well.
Yeah, I would love to have one in Georgia. So we got some questions here. Actually, I would like to ask the first question myself. My question is actually has two sides, technology-wise and economic-wise. Which component of CCUS is actually behind the other component? Is it capturing? Is it utilization or storage?
So I would argue, and I apologize if I've given anybody a seizure by just going through that, but the notion in the old days of the three-legged milking stool, and that is capture, transport, and storage. I think it's expanded beyond just three pieces. But as I said earlier, capture is the most costly piece, but we have chemical engineers and process engineers around the world that know how to do this. We may not be able to do it as cost effectively as a lot. We in the United States have been pushing CO2 in the ground for 40 years. People around the world have been putting natural gas in the ground for many, many years safely. And all jurisdictions in the world know how to transport goods. So it's ironic, but it comes back to this notion of the forum in that the real issues typically aren't technological. Yes, there are cost issues. And this provides a unique situation in that the technical folks that are trying to solve problems are trying to solve technical problems. When you look at this collection of technologies, i.e. CCUS, yes, there are economics that have to be addressed, but in many cases, these are public policy, public perception, and regulatory, and the reality of where are you? In the Northeast United States with all the granite, there just are not going to be storage opportunities. So you have to go where Mother Nature provided you the best opportunities to push the CO2. So that's a long-winded answer to say, I don't think there's any technological issue. I think we as a technical society, I'm speaking now as an SPE member and an AAPG member, I think we have either overlooked or undervalued these non-technical issues for too long. They're what's left for us to deal with, and we're wrestling with them now.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is from your ex-manager, so be careful when you answer.
That ought to be a good one.
So what barriers exist for Wyoming to receive CO2 from other states and store them in Wyoming oil fields or other sinks? Is this a business opportunity?
Well, I certainly think it's a business opportunity. But I think to the question of barriers, you know, states like Wyoming, or states in general, can be parochial. The legislature decides what comes in and what goes out of a state. So this notion of a regional hub that Wyoming is going to enter into and participate in, I think is a good acknowledgement that there are partners, there are partner organizations that states that they could join in together and participate in. I think the legislature ought to look at and incentivize bringing CO2 from outside the state. Part of this regional approach looks at the plains and the middle part of the country that has ethanol. There's an awful lot of CO2 from ethanol in Nebraska and Iowa and other places that they don't have a real great place to put it. So the notion that Wyoming, and again, the legislature, for being a volunteer government, that is, they meet 20 days a year every other year and 40 days a year every other year, have been very visionary and very forward-looking in order to do that. But you know, in the end, much of this is free, open market. If there's CO2 at the door knocking on a place to find where can I put this, you know, Wyoming has many places to put that. And I would say we would likely be more a CO2 taker than a CO2 exporter.
Okay, next question. What is the phase the CO2 would be transported and stored according to these plans?
Well, that would depend, but in general, it's most cost effective to do it at supercritical. Most of the CO2 EOR targets in Wyoming are miscible targets. And so we'd like to have that be supercritical. Obviously, it's a bit more costly. You need some compression and you have some energy penalties to do that, but you can certainly move much more volume of the CO2 when it's supercritical phase. I don't know of anybody that's not looking at it that way, but those could all be evaluated on a case-by-case basis or project-by-project basis. But if one wants to talk about a larger state network, my expectation would be supercritical.
Okay, and the last question that we have received here, what is the most significant impediment to full utilization?
If by full utilization, I'm going to interpret that to mean commercial deployment, right now is capital. I think there's a lot of money in the market that could be used, but there is a barrier and a perception. Certainly with oil prices and COVID-19, everything is on hold. 45Q in the United States provides a significant financial incentive to move forward, but it's not without its own issues. There are still questions yet of what is the certification mechanism, i.e. are using EPA's greenhouse gas subpart RR or using the ISO 27916 protocol to certify I put a ton of CO2 in the ground, therefore I'd like my 35 or my $50 a ton. That being said, you know, most of the private capital that's out there doesn't like coal, doesn't like fossil fuel. And so on the saline storage side, it doesn't produce additional hydrocarbons. So depending on whether or not your government is completely green and says there shall be no additional hydrocarbons, you know, we have an international group on the phone here today, and I think we all would agree that coal and natural gas are going to be a significant fuel supply for the coming decades. It still is the most stable, low-cost, carbon-intense fuel supply that's out there. So the issue here becomes back to the SPE forum. What are those non-technical issues? What are the policies and incentives that can happen to move this thing forward? And we're making progress. You know, the issue is, I don't think there's one silver bullet that if we could get this one thing, but if you look at collectively the incentives that are out there, certainly in the United States, and certainly in Wyoming with those items that I showed you that SPE suggested that are needed to move forward, they all exist in Wyoming. So I'm very hopeful with the creation of the Wyoming Energy Authority that when we come out of this COVID-19 place that we're in, and things get back to some semblance of normal, that there will be CCUS commercial developers knocking on our doors saying, okay, let's go.
Steve, you got one more question here, and I also have a question for you. I think we are far ahead of the time, so we have time to discuss more, right? You're not in rush.
Absolutely.
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
working for you today.
I appreciate that. So the question is that if Wyoming is carbon free, and if not, when would you anticipate it to be?
Well, it's an interesting question because the question is, what do you mean by carbon free? And I think everybody has a different definition of that. So instead of me taking a stab and being completely wrong from the get-go, back to my opening slide of primary, secondary, tertiary, or enhanced recovery. I think Wyoming is looking at reducing its carbon footprint. I think Wyoming is looking at, certainly if you look at House Bill 200, that says that CCUS, and if you look at the life cycle analysis of CCUS and CO2 EOR, that winds up having a less carbon intensive footprint than other fuels do. So that depends. And I also argue that as administrations change, as governors change, as presidents change, as prime ministers change, so does the public policy change. So it's hard for me to say at given date X, we're going to have something. But I think all the pieces are there moving in a direction to continue to reduce that. But I'm not sure any state will ever be, or any jurisdiction will ever be, quote unquote, carbon free by some jurisdictional deadline.
Okay, and my question, Steve, is with respect to the subsurface monitoring. What type of technologies are you using in Wyoming to monitor CO2 down there to make sure it's safe?
Certainly, and there's a couple answers to that question. Certainly, from the CO2 EOR standpoint, we have a number of CO2 floods that are currently enacted and deployed in the state of Wyoming. And so those use traditional monitoring well and breakthrough for CO2 that are required by the state. The two carbon safe projects for straight saline storage are looking at a host of both novel and off-the-shelf technologies that are available. There's a significant amount of downhole work that can be done. And so it depends. One of the great takeaways that I've garnered over the last couple of years is we try and take CCUS and cram this quote unquote technology into a box. But the thing about subsurface storage is it is not homogeneous. Every site has heterogeneity. So every individual storage site is going to have a set of requirements, or more importantly, a set of technologies that may be applicable. And there may be a set of technologies that aren't applicable. And the best success, I believe, will come when you do a good job of understanding a reservoir and understanding how you can understand that reservoir, i.e. what monitoring techniques do and don't work, and only apply those that work. A negative example is one of DOE's requirements is to look at soil gas. And while soil gas can tell you if there's CO2 coming out of the ground, I would argue that it's flawed because it has such temporal changes based on weather and growth patterns. But if we're worried about how much CO2 is coming out of the ground, and we haven't been concerned about how the CO2 breached, I don't know, let's say the 2 or 3 seals that are 5,000 feet or greater below the surface, those are significantly more important. I wouldn't spend a lot of time on soil gas as I would with other monitoring techniques. So there's a lot of novel things that are being tested right now by DOE and some things that EOR are testing. So anybody has any specific questions about that, I'd be more than happy to have a detailed conversation offline.
Sure. I think people captured your email from this slide. So if you have any further questions, you can directly contact Stephen. Steve, thank you very much again for sharing your time and knowledge with us. And I would like to thank everybody else attending the meeting. Thanks for your interest. The next presentation would be next Tuesday, and it would be on geothermal feasibility study. Please don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn for more update about our program and specifically for the June schedule. With that said, I would like to wish you all having a good time, good weekend, and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahmad. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.